So now it's a pleasure to introduce Jennifer R. J.R. Henneman, who is Director and Curator of the Petrie Institute of Western American Art at the Denver Art Museum. I first met JR at a symposium in 2017 at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, which was marking the centennial of William F. Cody's death. And she presented research on the American West at the U.S. exhibition in London in 1887. We shared excitement for the possibilities of transnationalism for understanding perceptions and constructions of the American West abroad. After completing her Ph.D. at the University of Washington, JR moved to Denver, where she began working as an assistant curator in the Western American Art Department. She's been there for about 7 years and has worked with our new museum director here, Thomas Brent Smith, on exhibition projects like the Homer Remington Forces of Nature, a collection catalog, and a permanent collection reinstall. When she approached me about her nascent exhibition topic about French Orientalism and U.S. settler paintings of Native Americans, I was delighted and have been proud to be involved with this project, which was supported by an NEH exhibition planning grant. The exhibition, Near East to Far West, Fictions of French and American Colonialism, is now open in Denver until late May. So please try to get there to see it in person if you haven't already. And here to tell us about this project, please join me in welcoming J.R. Henneman.
Good morning, everyone. How's my sound? Good. All right. I don't have a luxurious beard to contend with, like Jeremiah. Good morning, Emily. Thank you so much to you and your crew for organizing this event. Thank you to the Russell Center, the University of Oklahoma, for supporting it. Thank you to you all and those of you tuning in online for being here. Today, I make the claim that historical Western American art has fundamentally been a transnational endeavor, one with roots deeply entwined with European representations of the Orient. We cannot fully understand nor appreciate Western American art without acknowledging its transnational context of creation. This claim is not intuitive. Traditionally, Western American art has been valued for its perceived historical accuracy and for articulating a celebratory myth of the winning of the West. As art historian Peter H. Hasrick has stated, a split focus on accuracy and myth left the art part of Western American art adrift for much of the 20th century. Starting in the 1970s, two important avenues of scholarship emerged On one hand, post-colonial studies challenged the idea that Western American art provided an accurate historical representation of westward expansion, arguing instead that it obfuscated the realities of expansion under a romantic haze. In the other, scholars turned attention finally to the aesthetic history of Western American art, leading to examinations of patronage, the art market, artistic training, and cross-cultural exchange. Now, questions of aesthetics, colonial legacy, historical context, and interconnectedness inform Western American art studies. Scholars increasingly attend to the agency, survival, and resistance of cultures represented, and question the visual whitewashing of a diverse region. Others challenge an East Coast-centric canon by centering the people and landscapes of the West, while projects such as Near East to Far West reveal the importance of transnational exchange and grapple with the legacies of colonial representations. Today, to support my claim that we cannot fully understand nor appreciate Western American art without acknowledging its transnational context of creation, I will take you through the exhibition Near East to Far West, on view until May 29th, that's Memorial Day. This is the first project to consider how and why the American West was described, understood, and represented by Euro-Americans as a kind of Orient, an exotic place of cultural, religious, and geographical difference during the period of westward expansion. By taking a close look at the influence of French Orientalism on representations of the West, this project demonstrates that a transnational lens not only reinserts Western American art into its original global context of creation, but also allows us to crack open new questions and to grapple with colonial legacies. The first section of Near East to Far West is entitled Framing French Orientalism. This section provides definitions, establishes historical and geographical context, and displays a range of French Orientalist material to set the stage for comparisons to come. Let's begin with a few definitions. Orient is a European-derived term that comes from the Latin for east. Depending on the period and cultural viewpoint, the Orient could include North Africa, the Mediterranean Basin and Holy Land, and all of Asia. In this project, we use the word in its 19th century sense, when both it and Near East referred to the countries of North Africa and the greater Mediterranean Basin, most of which were under Ottoman control. This area is illustrated in the wall map accompanying the section text, which you see here in this image. Now the word Orientalism. In one sense, Orientalism refers to the broad array of visual, textual, and material culture produced in Europe, and that referenced or was influenced by the art and cultures of the greater Oriental world. The scope of this material is vast, covering centuries and continents. Near East to Far West takes a focused look at the material produced by French artists during the period of French colonial expansion into North Africa beginning in the 1830s, and considers how these artworks influenced representations of the American West created by Euro-American artists at the same time that the United States was also expanding colonially westward. Thus, Orientalism also manifests as a set of European and American-made visual tropes and artistic styles that continues to define the perceived appearance and behavior of colonized peoples and places. Comparing French representations of the Orient and Euro-American representations of the West reveals the repetition of certain motifs, and this is to say specific subjects and the way they are posed, as well as style, the ways in which the subjects themselves are rendered. Let me provide an example that we used in the first section of the exhibition to underscore this point. One motif that pulls through both French Orientalism and Western American art is that of the odalisque. In European representations, the odalisque is consistently presented in a reclining pose, looking out at us, towards us, the viewer. She is also often placed in a female-only domestic setting, which in a Muslim household is called a harem. We see this motif in Eugène Delacroix's Women of Algiers, in American Orientalist Frederick Arthur Bridgman's An Oriental Beauty, as well as in the Western work of Charles M. Russell, such as in his Kioma No. 1, and an earlier example, Alfred Jacob Miller's Indian Women. The transference of this motif of the odalisque from Orientalism to Western American art underscores that it functioned as shorthand for exotic woman in a transnational colonial language. And this leads me to yet another definition of Orientalism. In tandem with its representational mode, Orientalism has a political mode. It refers to a way of constructing knowledge about the world that reinforces dichotomous ideas embedded within colonial power structures. These include civilized versus savage, progress versus decline, manufactured versus natural, etc. It thus constitutes a facet of colonial ideology, or the opinions and beliefs shared by colonizers about would-be subjugated peoples and places that justifies colonial expansion. From this perspective, the Orient is presented as a place of savagery, primitivism, earthbound nobility, and simplicity, which reinforces the Occident, that is the greater West's desire to see itself as a place of civilization, progress, technology, industry, and complexity. Seeing and understanding North Africa and the American West as Orients depends upon the projection of similar racialized characteristics that reinforce perceptions of ethnic, cultural, religious, and geographic difference, as well as juxtapositions between progress, stagnancy, and modernity and backwardness. Within the context of colonial expansion, such difference served to justify the exploitation of natural resources and indigenous labor, and in the context of settler colonialism, the forcible seizure of indigenous lands and containment and removal of indigenous peoples. Let's return to the example of the odalisque, who is a product of the European imagination, and who is often sexualized through her pose, her gaze, and at times her nakedness. All of these components reinforce assumptions about the sexual availability of, in this case, Muslim and American indigenous women. Symbolically, the odalisque may function as a representation of people and lands to be conquered, essentially the colonizer's potential reward and trophy. Additionally, misperceptions of both Muslim and indigenous women as controlled by an all-powerful sheikh or chief seemed to provide evidence that they were in need of saving by European or Euro-American civilizing forces. Consider the note left by Alfred Jacob Miller accompanying a later version of Indian women, which you see on the bottom right. He writes, "Much cannot be said in favor of the manner in which the female part of the community are treated by the Indians. They are mere hewers of wood and drawers of water. The North American savage entertaining, we fear, a kindred opinion with the Turks, that is, that they have no souls. When the Grand Seigneur arrives, they set up his lodge, spread his robes, unladen his horses and mules, make his fire, and prepare his meat." As Scott Manning Stevens articulates in his essay in the accompanying exhibition catalog, Miller's perpetuation of the idea that Native American women are subservient to the Grand Seigneur reinforces a drudge stereotype of indigenous women that, like the trope of the odalisque, disrespects gender divisions of labor, denies the multifaceted and complex roles of women across cultures. Along with these stereotypes come violence that continue to impact indigenous communities. Consider, for example, that sexualized representations play a part in the ongoing crimes against missing and murdered indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, a fact we acknowledge in the exhibition text. As you can see, in this first section, we do a lot of heavy lifting to situate viewers historically and geographically, to define terms, and to acknowledge the continuing legacies of colonial representations. We also provide a range of Orientalist imagery produced mostly by French artists to make a broad point about style, that there is no one way artists depicted the Orient, and that the stylistic choices each made profoundly impacts the way any artwork creates meaning about its subject. The pairing of Eugène Fromentin's An Encampment in the Atlas Mountains with Luc-Olivier Merson's Cleopatra Descending the Nile, this pairing reinforces this point and also raises questions about artistic authority. French Orientalism spans a range of imagery. On one end, we find imagined history paintings like Merson's Egyptian Spectacle, inspired by nearly a century of Egyptomania, spurred by Napoleon's failed attempts to colonize Egypt in 1798 and 99. On the other hand, we find work like Fromentin, his In the Atlas Mountains. Inspired by first-person experience, it was painted over a decade after the artist's last trip to Algeria, one of 3 total trips he made between 1846 and 1853. Now, as you can see, Fromentin's painting style is decidedly looser than Merson's, his colors less punchy, more atmospheric. Merson's firm handling of paint, which carefully delineates details and is executed with a smooth surface finish, seems to say, "I know what I see," while Fromentin seems to say, "I know what I feel." An American-born critic, Henry James, pointed out something similar when writing about the work of the great Orientalists Jean-Léon Gérôme and Eugène Delacroix. He wrote, "Such a painter as Gérôme gives us most skillfully the surface of Eastern life. Delacroix gives us its substance." It is, in fact, the combination of these, of surface and substance, that gives the artworks in this exhibition such visual and emotional power. Surfaces depicted create convincing space and narrative, but the surfaces of the artworks themselves, these constructed objects, are carefully finished with minute blended brushstrokes on one hand or ravished with dynamic sculptural arcs of paint on the other. This finish itself speaks volume about what James called substance, or emotive feeling. The combination of surface and substance gives French Orientalist and Western American artworks commanding visual authority and emotional intensity. In the words, while these artworks impress us with the insistent richness of their visual diet, in the words of Linda Nochlin, they are nonetheless restricted by limits to knowledge, responsive to the constraints and demands of Eurocentric art market dynamics, and fundamentally haunted by absences, the absence of time, modernity, and the effects of colonization, to name just a few. And this explains the subtitle of the exhibition, Fictions of French and American Colonialism, and a fundamental argument of this project, that by putting Western American art into conversation with French Orientalism, we may understand both bodies of work as constructed narrative objects, rendered with meticulous degrees of realism and emotion, harnessing power from kernels of truth mined from careful observation, first-hand experience, and memory. They present a variety of transportive fictions about the indigenous and North African world, and share similar visual languages created by and useful to the colonial contexts in which they were produced and to which they responded. And this is why, in the exhibition text, we ask such questions as, to what degree is it possible to disentangle fact from fiction? How can we cultivate a critical eye in the face of beauty? As we ask visitors to simultaneously hold multiple and contradictory feelings and thoughts as they consider the impacts of this colonial legacy. While a transnational art historical narrative underpins this exhibition, it is ultimately an exercise in close looking and self-reflection. What expectations or biases might we have inherited? And how might considering this important art historical story change or modify what we think we know about the world, or what we think an artwork can tell us about it? Let's move to the next section. American Sahara is a thematic section focusing on the symbolism of the desert and the ways in which artists grappled with its unfamiliar and challenging aesthetic. During the 19th century, few Europeans and Euro-Americans would have ever experienced a true desert firsthand. But images and popular perceptions of the desert permeated the American and European imagination, largely because of the Bible and because of fiction such as the Arabian Nights. As American explorers pushed westward, challenged to describe the vast arid spaces they encountered, they often invoked the best-known desert, the African Sahara, thereby using orientalizing language to try to express the scope and appearance of what was to them and their readers new land. References to biblical landscapes established connections between the American West and the Holy Land, reinforcing the idea that Euro-Americans were God's chosen people pursuing a divinely ordained future. French and American artists often accompanied military-led expeditions into colonized lands, allowing them unprecedented access to these desert regions. And in response, artists had to expand their aesthetic repertoire to try to grapple with the experience and the appearance of this, to them, foreign landscape. This is the first section to commingle French and American art on the same wall with unexpected neighbors Frederick Remington, Théodore Frère, Fernand Lundgren, Charles M. Russell, and Gustave Guillaume, who you see on this wall in this image. As articulated by these artists, the desert is perhaps the most sublime landscape imaginable. It is one of great beauty and color, unknown in the more humid climates of Europe and the eastern U.S. seaboard. But it is also an environment that will kill you. Invoking an African desert to describe swaths of the American West helped Euro-American explorers express the vastness and strangeness of this geography. Desert spaces functioned as stages upon which fantasies could be built, in the words of Richard Francaviglia in his essay for the catalog, offering landscapes in which the human imagination can run wild. But these were also very real spaces that challenged European and Euro-American bodies and ways of seeing. The next section is the first of two artist-to-artist comparisons. And here we put Eugène Delacroix and Alfred Jacob Miller together. In 1832, Miller studied abroad in Italy and France. And while in Paris, he studied the work of Eugène Delacroix. We know that he did. However, Delacroix was not in town. In 1832, he was on his one and only trip to North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria. And after his return for the rest of his career, from the vantage point of his Paris studio, Delacroix would produce representations of his Orient, of his North Africa. Similarly, once Miller returned to the U.S., he was soon after invited to one of the last great fur trappers' rendezvous, which took place in what is now Wyoming. And after that one and only trip to the American West, he returned to his Baltimore studio and, from the vantage point of Baltimore, produced for decades representations of his American Wests. These single adventures impacted both artists' careers and promoted the mythos of the artist explorer. Now, both artists were deeply indebted to European Romanticism, a movement in arts and philosophy that emphasized feeling and expression. So, as we can see in the comparisons we set up in this section, their work often underscores ideas of nobility, energy, drama, sensuality. In comparisons such as the one you see here, we ask viewers to consider what Miller might have learned from Delacroix and his contemporaries, noticed a shared interest in dramatic, often violent subjects, rendered, however, in the most elegant way possible with these twisting bodies contorted around each other. Notice similar uses of color, especially the power colors of white and red. But also notice how their work differs. Delacroix's brushstroke is much more present and dynamic than Miller's, which has a smoother surface finish. After this comparison, we move to big cats and bison, another thematic section. Colonial expansion into North Africa and the West contributed to the decimation of animals such as lions and bisons, yet also opened new opportunities to study these exotic creatures. Collections of animals, or called menageries, became increasingly accessible to a larger public during the 1800s. And at the Ménagerie du Jardin des Plantes in Paris, viewers marveled at the animals kept in captivity, including many kinds of big cats and even American bison. Animalier, or animal artists, spent hours sketching there. And this is a later sketch, but it is a representation that helps express the fact that zoos then did not look like zoos do now. It gives you a sense of how close the artists literally were to these animals, as well as the truly constrained kind of confinement in which these animals were kept. Representations of exotic animals reflected ambivalent feelings towards so-called untamed lands. Some artists emphasized terrifying snarls and dramatic hunting scenes, such as you see in Delacroix's Lion Hunt. And this reinforced the idea that these places were dangerous and wild, in need of taming. But other artists presented quieter, more pensive representations, such as in Barry's Two Cape Lions and Gérôme's Night in the Desert. Here the artists keep in mind how these artists are studying these big cats. They're not then painting them in cages, rather they're metaphorically liberating them into imagined landscapes, alluding to the harsh realities of caged confinement, and perhaps telling us something about their own ambivalent feelings towards the colonial projects that instigated their captivity in the heart of Paris. Now, bison feature on the wall opposite the big cats, and at times their representations echo the nostalgia and drama of their French counterparts. Consider Delacroix's Lion Hunt in conversation with Russell's Meat for Wild Men, buffalo hunt. But in the United States, the bison underwent a unique symbolic transition. During the early decades of expansion, they represented a noble but doomed obstacle to civilization. They were in the way, literally. Ultimately, however, they became a symbol of the nation that nearly caused their extinction in an effort to control the indigenous populations who relied on them. Consider that Alexander Phimister Proctor's buffalo was created to grace the Dumbarton or Q Street Bridge in Washington, D.C. As Christine Garnier points out in her essay in the catalog, the romanticism of the American bison by Euro-American artists exemplifies imperialist nostalgia, or the mourning of a culture by a society whose members caused its destruction. This is a definition provided by anthropologist Renato Rosaldo. Now, more than effectively than any wall text, the wall mural of a photograph featuring a pile of buffalo skulls and bones that is over 3 stories tall in real life. We actually literally didn't have the space to blow it up life size. This image potently gets at the magnitude of this destruction. A video developed by the World Wildlife Fund and the Fort Peck Reservation acknowledges the trauma of this decimation and contemporary work to rehabilitate herds. So a note on interpretation, layered interpretation, which we do throughout the exhibition. The hope is that layered interpretation such as this can surface the histories and voices that are often absent and even silenced by the artworks. Recognizing the challenging nature of this material, over the course of years, we did work closely with a range of consultants to better understand how to sensitively surface these perspectives. These consultants included the Denver Art Museum's own Internal Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, its Indigenous Advisory Council, and a cohort of the museum's gallery hosts, who are the people who spend time in the galleries with our visitors. An NEH planning grant funded a group of external scholars, Dr. Burns was one of them, as well as a series of focus groups composed of members from the region's Indigenous, Arab, and Muslim communities. Catalog contributors, all 12 of them, provided thoughtful deep dives into exhibition topics, and we hired Indigenous, Arab, and Muslim readers to review and edit all of the exhibition text. So within the exhibition, this collaborative work manifests as a series of community voice labels. These reveal the diverse ways in which artworks might be approached, understood, and questioned. We have 2 audio conversations between Indigenous and Arab Muslim scholars and artists on select artwork comparisons within the exhibition. One is in this section devoted to representations of women, which we saw earlier, and the other is an upcoming artistic comparison between Jean-Léon Gérôme and George DeForest Brush. Our consultants advised on the images selected for wall murals and helped us determine which issues and questions were the most important to raise within the admittedly limited scope of any exhibition. Our consultants also helped us think through how to engage contemporary artists, if at all, which leads me to the next space in the exhibition, the reflection space. When the Denver Art Museum does big shows like this is a 10,000 square foot temporary exhibition, we always build in an interpretive or reflection zone just to give the visitors a chance to pause and think and take a visual break. And one thing that we did in this exhibit for the first time was to utilize scent, the olfactory scent, by commissioning the contemporary perfumer Dana El Masri, who is of Egyptian Lebanese heritage and lives in Montreal, to create 2 custom scents. So you see there are 2 scents on a total of 4 for tall people and shorter people on the pedestals on the right. And the one scent is meant to evoke kind of a stereotyped vision of Orientalism, which has impacted French perfumery. And then the second is her own take on what it is to be home or to go home, what it is to get off the plane in your homeland, what the air smells like. That is her trying to combat the stereotyped idea of Orientalism. And so you can see we have scents, we have a place to sit down, read the catalog, take a break. On the wall that you can't see behind us, you can literally leave responses on pieces of paper that you hang on the wall. And by now our stacks of responses, we're deep in them, and we've been just blown away by the often reflective, very passionate, very personal, sometimes very divisive responses that visitors have left for us. Now, after pausing in this space, the next section presents that second artist-to-artist comparison between Jean-Léon Gérôme and his American student, George DeForest Brush. Gérôme was like the Orientalist of the 19th century, and he taught hundreds of American students, including Brush, who spent a little less than 6 years with him, and then returned to the U.S. and produced a series of what he called Indian paintings that are very much rendered in the refined, carefully composed style of his teacher, Gérôme. They both worked in the academic tradition and sought universal beauty through emphasis on the human body, elegant composition, and convincing depth and space that would transcend the mundane and transport viewers to other worlds. Their artworks may look real, but they are products of each man's imagination. Their style is entirely seductive. Because of such careful attention to detail and refined finish, they seem visually authoritative. And that's the primary risk of artworks like these. Yes, they are created from first-person observation, but the artists are using their observation and choices to create fictions. These are beautiful fantasies. These are storytelling devices. These are not analogs to history. Indeed, Brush himself wrote that he did not paint from the historian's or the antiquarian's point of view, and that if required to supply historical facts, he would drop the subject at once. And so when we start to ask questions about style and aesthetics, which leads us to larger inquiries about artistic training, intention, and audience, we are able to get beyond the seeming authenticity of such artworks to explore the much larger and, frankly, more interesting context of their creation, as well as the ways in which these artworks create and reinforce meaning. Now, the next section focuses on the Chicago Columbian Exposition held in Chicago from May to October 1893. World's fairs were massive multi-acre spectacles. They showcased artworks, commercial products, architecture, design, science, technology, and literally people from across the globe. They produced and disseminated orientalizing imagery to millions of attendees in Europe and the United States. So here what you see in the wall case is a range of material from the Columbian Expo, including guidebooks, entry tickets, photographs, and a digital interactive of the fairgrounds developed by the Chicago 00 project, which all of which try to help visitors understand just the magnitude of this spectacle and the ways in which people were displayed. Over 27 million visitors attended this event in Chicago, including the artists Frederick Remington and Charles Russell. And North African exhibitions, including the Cairo Street and Bedouins performing as part of the Wild East, left impressions on both men. It is possible that Russell's and Remington's shared interest in Bedouin and Arab equestrian cultures reflects their awareness that horsemanship in the Americas had, in part, originated with the Spanish colonial armies, whose own horses, tack, and techniques had been influenced by North African breeds and practices. And I'll put in a plug on May 2nd. Your own Michael Grauer here is going to be in Denver talking about the African roots of American equestrianism. It's a live event in Denver, but we will be streaming it as well if you'd like to tune in to that. I have a lot to learn from Michael, and I'm really looking forward to it. Now, notice how in a watercolor from 1908, Russell directly references the architecture of the Cairo Street, an Egyptian exhibit within the Columbian Exposition that was also recreated in the 1904 St. Louis Expo, which Russell also attended. In this watercolor, Russell depicts one of the most, in addition to the architecture of the street, he also depicts one of the most popular attractions of the expo, which was the belly dancer. Now, Remington was sent to the expo as a reporter for Harper's, and he was so enamored by the Bedouin riders that this is at the National Cowboy. Thank you very much for the generous loan. This is the drawing he produced for the cover of Harper's to document his time at the Chicago Columbian Expo. In fact, the next year, 1894, he took a trip to Algeria himself, where he took photographs, one of which is blown up as a wall mural here. He made sketches, some of which were published as illustrations, and collected Algerian stirrups and spurs that he kept on display in his studio, all of which are in Denver at the moment. Now, although anthropological exhibit at World's Fairs reinforced a colonial narrative of progress that seemed to provide scientific evidence that the non-white world was barbaric and childlike, global representatives found myriad ways to push back against these constructions, a topic that Emily Burns addresses in the exhibition catalog and is written about extensively elsewhere, as have many other scholars. World's Fairs provided platforms for challenging and rewriting colonial narratives, and indigenous people and artworks participated in these modern environments. So one way we try to get at this agency and presence is through the incorporation of American indigenous and Islamic artworks. Because by the late 1800s, both of these indigenous and Islamic arts circulated throughout international markets and directly impacted European and American art and design. One example we present is Paulding Farnham's silver vessel, which is in the case behind the image. This he created for Tiffany & Company, and it was on display in 1893 in Chicago. It clearly references motifs and forms of Pueblo vessels. Two of which, from the Denver Art Museum's collection, we put on display next to it. By transforming and appropriating indigenous designs, such artworks as Farnham's simultaneously celebrate and attempt to replace indigenous artists. Today, such visual fusions raise questions about the line between inspiration and appropriation. And earlier in the exhibit, we do something similar with a silver coffee pot by Edward C. Moore on the left, who was the first chief designer for Tiffany & Co. And then we have next to it a 14th century Egyptian tray to give you a sense of the ways in which he's looking at these Islamic arts and incorporating their motifs, a kind of mishmash of orientalized motifs into his own works. He also used his collection of Islamic arts as teaching tools in the studios of Tiffany & Co. And then his Islamic arts collection ultimately was given to the Met, where it's now became one of the foundational collections at that museum for Islamic arts. Okay, I think we need to. So basically, what these decorative arts moments are trying to raise questions about inspiration and appropriation, but also acknowledge agency on the part of indigenous and Islamic creators that is certainly not present in the other artworks on display. Finally, and in respect of our time, we're going to move to the last section of the exhibition, which is called Lands of Light. And this considers the work of select American artists who studied with French Orientalists in Paris during the 1880s and 1890s, and then ended up in the village of Taos, New Mexico, where they formed the Taos Society of Artists in 1915. The elements that made this region of New Mexico so attractive to these artists were comparable to what had made North Africa so enticing to their French counterparts. The clear air of the high desert, the formal challenge of depicting color and shadow in desert light, expansive landscapes, geometric adobe architecture, and of course, indigenous subjects. As transportation infrastructure improved alongside the colonization projects in Algeria and the American West, artists increasingly traveled to previously inaccessible pockets of these regions, where the brilliant light and ancient geographies of these spaces challenged them to work in increasingly modern hues and forms. So this section brings together many of the themes and questions already raised throughout the show. It puts the work of American artists into conversation with their French teachers. Consider this pairing of Causse with Bouguereau, and in addition, this above Sharp with his teacher Benjamin Constant. It reveals the ways in which artists attempted to capture the light and ancient geographies of these environments, as you see in these extraordinary paintings by Bailly and Blumenschein, and it underscores continued interest in the exotic cultures of these regions. Now, in this section, we have a final intervention by two contemporary artists, the Muskogee poet Jennifer Elise Forrester and the Navajo, Laguna, Pueblo multidisciplinary artist Stephen Yazzie. Now, because of our time, I'm actually not going to go into great depth about this. In a nutshell, Jennifer wrote a poem that she was given the checklist of the exhibition. She wrote literally lines and lines and lines of responses to each artwork on display, which she then condensed and transformed and recreated into what she calls a kaleidoscopic poem, a new gallery of perceptions. And then Jennifer worked with Stephen Yazzie to collaborate on a video accompanying the poem. And Stephen, when he heard about Jennifer's process, he thought, that sounds a lot like AI to me. And so he actually fed Midjourney, an AI generator, words from Jennifer's poem and artworks from the exhibition to create hundreds of images that he and his team then chose from. They animated the images, they laid some atmospheric sounds over the top, and put them together with Jennifer's poem. And the resulting work is haunting and beautiful. And in their words, its point is to provide new questions. We cannot answer, questions that we cannot answer, nor should we. Their hope is to define the strange beauty and unease one might feel while watching this poem, and offer to the viewer kind of an added dimension, a reflection of the exhibition, to ask the question, who are we now in our looking at one another, in our looking for another, as we look at our past, as we look to our future. And Dana, Jennifer, and Stephen will all be participating in an artist panel on Tuesday evening, April 25th. Again, it's a live event in Denver that we will stream online. So if you'd like to hear more in their own words, and they are all so eloquent and articulate, the ways in which they grappled with the content and questions raised by this project, please let me know and tune in on Tuesday, April 25th. So I promise I am going to conclude right now in about 30 seconds. Using Orientalism as a critical lens to ask questions about visual and historical absence is a useful tool for better understanding the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism and its visual vocabularies. As the first extended consideration of this lens on Western American art, Near East to Far West creates a foundation for continued conversations about the power and possibilities of historical artworks. It situates artworks in their time, reminds us of limits to our own perspectives, knowledge, vision, and memory, and reasserts a transnational art history integral to understanding how history and colonial representation continue to impact the present. Thank you very much. I nailed my 45 minutes. 2 minutes to spare. Hey.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, JR. And yes, we do have a few questions, so I'll begin with the ones that I have as others in the audience keep thinking about what they want to ask. So to start, we have a question which my eyesight has been destroyed from my comps, so if I don't read your question correctly, I apologize. So the first question we have is, what accounts for the similarities between the depictions by French and Western American painters? What accounts for it? Sorry, I read that kind of odd. Is it a matter of influence, such as Delacroix and Miller, or more of a parallel structure, such as colonialism and conquest, producing similar topics and themes?
Yeah, it's actually both direct and indirect. So the direct connections are absolutely the artist-to-artist legacies, the transference of tradition, the transference of knowledge via artistic technique and tradition. So you see that in the comparative studies that we set up. But there's also an indirect, well, maybe there's three. So there's direct, there's indirect, which is just the diffusion of Oriental imagery throughout American culture at this time, via photography, works on paper, certainly the fine arts, decorative arts, world's fairs. Somebody like Charles Russell is a great example. You saw his Kioma #1. That is clearly in the form of an odalisque. He's working in Cascade, Montana, like the middle of nowhere, and I'm from there. I can tell you that. It's truly the middle of nowhere. But even Russell is influenced by Orientalizing imagery through all of the popular media that permeates culture, American culture at this time. So it's just a diffusion of these Orientalizing tropes. I forgot literature, I forgot opera, I forgot music. I mean, it's just throughout. The third component is just a shared context of colonial expansion. Both countries are looking outside in similar ways. I'm not saying the colonial projects are identical. They are not. But there's a resonance between the ways in which artists, in this case, are looking out towards these would-be colonized peoples and places. And why I call it a visual language is because that the ways of depicting and representing are useful to both French and American projects. So the colonial context, the interest in these subjects, these peoples and places, only supports and reinforces the usefulness of the visual language itself. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for that response. And speaking of visual language, we have a few questions here about exhibit design. Specifically, the one I'm looking at is asking about these cutoffs you see, cutouts on the wall. Could you please go into a little bit of detail about how this design came together?
So I'm happy to. I could go on for a long while about exhibit design. It's really a fun part of the process. One thing I'll note, first and foremost, is the architecture with which we get to work at the Denver Art Museum here in this space is really challenging. None of the walls there are no corners, like there are no 90-degree angles. Everything's at a slant, including the ceiling, which goes, I think, from 12 feet to 30 feet. So it's a a monumental space, and a question for every designer is, how do you humanize it? How do you bring people back in and make it make sense? So that's the first and foremost exhibition design consideration. Now, secondly, when we were thinking about the mood and the feel and the atmosphere of the show, one thing we knew was that when you're dealing with Orientalism and Western American art, you fall into cliche very quickly, very easily. Cliche and stereotype abound. So how do we present a design that invokes or references both of these seemingly disparate bodies of work without actually directly referencing either one? And I was, in my research and travels, I was absolutely influenced by exhibition design, usually used in Oriental or Islamic arts exhibition, where negative space is utilized to throw light through, which does evoke mosque architecture, mosque lamps, but often also has a kind of organic feel of what I experience is when I walk through an aspen forest and the light is kind of filtering through these organic shapes. So what we ended up trying to achieve with our designers was a pattern that was not directly referential, but that did serve a purpose to kind of set a mood, set a space, and evoke, in a way, some of this organic experience. And it's become an excellent Rorschach test. So when people enter the exhibit and ask me, what does that pattern mean? I say, well, what does it mean to you? And we've had some great responses. It's shattered glass, it's a mosaic, it's the cracks in dry desert mud, it's stones turning to sand, it's disco giraffe. I mean, we've had all sorts of responses, and I hope that means that we've at least accomplished something in presenting a visually interesting design. And the first presentation by our designers, IKD, a really excellent design firm, utilized this pattern. It kind of like there was very little of it at the beginning, and then by the end of the show, it was all over the walls. And you know what that did to the artwork? It made it look really bad. So we said we got to pull it back just a little bit so the paintings can really do their work. And so what we ended up doing is using the pattern in strategic ways. And across media, you see the perforated wall here where we can throw light through. You get a peek through. You see the pattern printed on fabric. And then we also use it on wall vinyl to establish exhibition sections. There. See it there? So the pattern ended up functioning as a design element that helped mark transition from one section to the next, supported by color choice, of course. I could go on, but I hope that answers the question.
I think it does, and I'm sure we can follow up with you later. But in thinking about light in this exhibit, we have a question more about metaphorical spotlights. So this question reads, to what extent do the oil paintings in the exhibit resist the spotlight on their fictions? How do the historical and the contemporary multimedia interventions operate in calling attention to these fictive constructions?
We always came back with our consultants, with our focus groups, with our exhibition team, to the fact that these paintings were created to be transportive, seductive, powerful, and they continue to be. Just because we're looking at them 200 years later doesn't mean they haven't lost that effectiveness. How do we mitigate the risk of celebrating or reinforcing the ideas that they may portray that have harmed global indigenous communities? How do we mitigate that? By celebrating the artistry, which is my very diplomatic way of saying, calling attention to the fact that they're all made up by exquisite technique. So we tried to balance the risks of the material through an attention to technique, an attention to audience, to market, to intention, again, by reinforcing that most of the artists here, while they definitely want cred for depicting things well and accurately, they are not trying to paint history. That's really not the point. And if we see that as the point, then we've, in my words, done a great disservice to the artistic endeavor. We've kind of flattened what they actually have accomplished, which is this kind of transportive, powerful experience. So all of the layered interpretation, all of it is meant to try to combat that in ways that we hope are stepped in such a way that people can follow along with us and learn along the way. It's a great question. It's a really complicated one. I'd be happy to talk about specific cases, would be helpful. At lunch, in the next coffee break, come talk to me.
Absolutely. And in thinking about how the aims of these paintings weren't history, I was thinking a lot about patronage. So the TSA artist, for example, often worked with the railroad, and Miller having a Scottish patron for a lot of his American scenes. How did this idea of patronage in this context come into play?
Well, I think just as you point out, every artist has an individual motivation and an individual audience in mind, and they are trying to make a living from doing their work. They are trying to sell their work to get prestige, to be seen. But each artist is an individual, so you would have to sink into each artist's specific narrative and context. What we try to do is remind people that these paintings, for the most part, were produced in urban centers. Paris, New York, Baltimore, primarily. Or in the case of the TSA, they were painted perhaps in Taos, but they were exhibited in Chicago, New York. That's where the market was. You had to show there. You had to sell there. And with that in itself, I think, does a lot of work in reminding people, our visitors, that this material has a specific context, it has a specific market, and it may not be who you immediately assume. It's actually this 19th century urban market.
Thank you. And in thinking of audiences, we have a question from the internet here. And this one's from Thomas.
It's not AI generated.
No, I don't think so. We can ask Jonathan. But Thomas asks, you secured several loans from French museums. How receptive were French institutions and their curators to the theses that you have introduced in this project?
Oh, I was just having this conversation this morning. So my hope was to co-develop this project with the French curator. And so I was spending a lot of time pre-pandemic. None of us knew what was coming in France, trying to get a partner. And because I think it would have been a really interesting project to have that French perspective. It would have been a very different project. But while there was a lot of interest in the artworks and the material, Algeria was a hot potato. Nobody wanted to touch it. And similarly, in the U.S., we still find it very challenging to grapple with our settler colonialist legacy. I'm not saying we're not answering it. We're just grappling with it. We're just trying to acknowledge and figure out how do we talk about this. So unfortunately, for many different reasons, I did not have a French collaborator. But the French museums were very willing to lend. And that said, I did source almost 90% of the material from the U.S. because so much French material came to the U.S. in the 19th century and remains here. And so I actually didn't have to call upon my French colleagues as extensively as I assumed I would have needed to. And this did alleviate the budget in significant ways. But the ones that we approached, including the Musée d'Orsay, Bordeaux, Nantes, oh my God, a beautiful Girardet from the Nantes, they were very accommodating and collegial, and I'm very grateful to them.
Well, that's great to hear. And I have two questions for you left. So the first one asks, can you speak to how plein air sketching and painting connects these notions of authenticity and reality that the exhibition challenges in relation to the artists working in East Coast / Paris studios?
That's a great question, and it's just not one that we tackled too deeply in this project because that would be a whole show in its own right. Did that question come from Michael?
No.
Oh, okay. It's a great question. And one thing that I think it's important to remember, this show is asking visitors to acknowledge and appreciate the constructed nature of these artworks. But that does not mean that artists have not spent significant time sketching outdoors, painting outdoors, trying to wrap their minds around how to capture the light and color of the desert, this completely new space for them. There is great attention to color, light, detail, landscape, culture, all of that goes into making these objects, and that's partly why they're so good and so powerful. But please remember that at the works we have on display, with the exception of a few sketches by Delacroix and Miller, they are all studio productions, and we really need to acknowledge the context and the technique, the true skill and labor that goes into creating what we call a finished studio production, meant to be seen on the walls of the Paris Salon or the National Academy of Design. But the outdoor, the plein air sketching, the careful attention to objects, to the human form, these are all part of the tradition that allows artists to create artworks that can still mean and express and feel so powerfully today.
Yes, thank you. And our final question is from Michael, and he asks, sorry, well, you wrote your name on it, so okay. He asks, where did/does Latino culture fit into this context in these depictions?
That is not, I'm sorry, I cannot answer that question because that's a whole different show, and I haven't done that research. Somebody should do that show. It'd be a great show, but I don't know. That's not my expertise at the moment.
Right. It's interesting because the TSA artists did depict the Hispano populations, which maybe, Michael, that's what you're referring to. But
yeah, it would be great to dig into that a little bit more, but less so than indigenous subjects. So it would be a great other chapter, kind of southern looking chapter. Absolutely.
Well, we'll look into it.
Yeah.
But thank you.
That.
Yes, thank you, JR.
Somebody do it. Thank you so much. See you at lunch. Thank you.